Adapted from archaic translation by H.T. Francis and Ra. Neil. Jataka number 312. Kassapamandiya Jataka. Should foolish youth, etc. This story the master told while residing at Jetavana monastery, about an aged brother, a young nobleman at Shravasti city. Tradition says, from a sense of the evil consequences of sinful desires received ordination at the hands of the master, and by devotion to the rite by which ecstasy may be induced, in no long time attained to sainthood. In due course of time, on the death of his mother, he admitted his father and younger brother to holy order of disciples, and they took up their dwelling at Jetavana monastery. At the opening of the rainy season, hearing of a village retreat where the necessary robes were to be easily obtained, they all three entered upon the rainy season's residence there, and when it was ended they returned straight to Jetavana monastery. The youthful brother, when they came to a spot not far from Jetavana monastery, told the novice boy to bring on the old man quietly, while he himself pushed on ahead to Jetavana monastery to get ready their cell. The old elder monk walked slowly on. The novice repeatedly butted him, as it were, with his head, and dragged him along by force, crying, "Come on, master." The elder monk said, "You are pulling me along against my will," and turning back he made a fresh start from the beginning. As they were thus quarreling, the sun went down and darkness set in. The young brother meanwhile swept out his hut, set water in the pots, and not seeing them coming, he took a torch and went to meet them. When he saw them coming, he asked what made him so late. The old man gave the reason. So he made them rest and brought them slowly on their way. That day he found no time to pay his respects to the Buddha. So on the next day, when he had come to pay his respects to Buddha, after he had saluted him and taken his seat, the master asked, "When did you arrive?" "Yesterday, sir." "You came yesterday and pay your respects to me only today?" "Yes, sir," he answered, and told him the reason. The master rebuked the elder monk. Not now only does he act like this. Of old too he did just the same. Now it is you that are annoyed by him. Formerly he annoyed wise men. And at the brother's request he told an old story. Once upon a time when Brahmadatta reigned in Benares, the Bodhisattva came to life in a Brahmin family in a town of the Kasi country. When he was grown up, his mother died. And after due performance of her funeral rites, at the end of 6 weeks he gave away in alms all the money that was in the house. And taking his father and younger brother with him, he put on the bark garment of somebody or other, and adopted the religious life of an ascetic in the Himalaya country. And there he lived in a pleasant grove, supporting himself by leftovers in the fields and living on roots and wild fruits. Now in the Himalaya, during the rainy season, when the rains are continuous, as it is impossible to dig up any bulb or root, or to get any wild fruits, and the leaves begin to fall, the ascetics for the most part come down from the Himalayas, and take up their dwelling amidst the habitations of men. And at this time the Bodhisattva, after living here with his father and younger brother, as soon as the Himalaya country began to blossom again and bear fruit, took his 2 companions and returned to his hermitage in the Himalayas. And at sunset, when they were not far from his hut, he left them, saying, "You can come on slowly, while I go forward and set the hermitage in order." Now the young hermit, coming on slowly with his father, kept butting him in the waist with his head. The old man said, "I do not like the way in which you are taking me home." So he turned back and started afresh from the same point. And while they were thus quarreling, darkness set in. But the Bodhisattva, as soon as he had swept out his hut of leaves, and got ready some water, took a torch and returned on the way back, and when he found them he asked why they had taken such a long time. And the boy ascetic told him what his father had done. But the Bodhisattva brought them quietly home, and having stored safely away all the Buddhist necessities, he gave his father a bath, and washed and anointed his feet and shampooed his back. Then he set out a pan of charcoal, and when his father had recovered from his fatigue, he sat near him and said, "Father, young boys are just like earthen vessels. They are broken in a moment, and when they are once broken, it is impossible to mend them again. Old men should bear with them patiently, when they are abusive." And for the advice of his father Kashyapa, he repeated these stanzas. Should foolish youth in word or deed offend, it is wisdom's part long-suffering to display. Quarrels of good men find a speedy end, fools part apart, like untempered clay. Men wise to learn, of their own sins aware, friendship can prove, that suffers no decay. Such are a brother's burden strong to bear, and dispute of neighbors skillful to ease. Thus did the Bodhisattva advised his father. And he from that time forward exercised self-restraint. The master, having brought his lesson to an end, identified the birth. At that time the old priest was the father hermit, the novice was the boy hermit, and I myself was the son who advised his father. Source. Adapted from archaic translation by H.T. Francis and Ra. Neil. Jataka number 313. Khantivādi Jataka. Whosoever cut of, etc. This story the master, while living at Jetavana monastery, told about a full of anger brother. The incident that gave rise to the story has been already described. The master asked that brother, saying, "Why after taking to holy order of disciples under the path of the Buddha who knows not what anger is, do you show anger? Wise men in past days, though they suffered 1,000 stripes, and had their hands and feet and ears and nose cut off, showed no anger against another." And he then told a story of the olden time. Once upon a time a king of Kasi named Kalabu reigned at Benares. At that time the Bodhisattva came to life in a Brahmin family blessed with 80 crores of treasure, in the form of a youth named Khuddaka Kumara. And when he was of age, he acquired a knowledge of all the sciences at Taxila and afterwards settled down as a householder. On the death of his parents, looking at his pile of treasure he thought, "My kinsmen who amassed this treasure are all gone without taking it with them. Now it is for me to own it and in my turn to depart." Then he carefully selected persons, who by virtue of their almsgiving deserved it, and gave all his wealth to them, and entering the Himalaya country he adopted the ascetic life. There he lived a long time, living on wild fruits. And descending to the inhabited parts for the sake of procuring salt and vinegar, he gradually made his way to Benares, where he took up his dwelling in the royal park. Next day he went his rounds in the city for alms, till he came to the door of the commander-in-chief. And he being pleased with the ascetic for the righteousness of his mannerisms, brought him into the house and fed him with the food prepared for himself. And having gained his consent he got him to take up his dwelling in the royal park. Now one day King Kalabu being inflamed with strong drink came into the park in great pomp, surrounded by a company of dancers. Then he had a couch spread on the royal seat of stone, and lay with his head on the lap of a favorite of the harem. While the dancing girls who were skillful in vocal and instrumental music and in dancing provided a musical entertainment, so great was his magnificence. Like to that of Sakka, Lord of Heaven, and the king fell asleep. Then the women said, "He for whose sake we are providing music, is gone to sleep. What need is there for us to sing?" Then they throw aside their lutes and other musical instruments here and there. and set out for the garden, where, tempted on by the flowers and fruit-bearing shrubs, they were soon frolicking themselves. At this moment the Bodhisattva was seated in this garden, like a royal elephant in the pride of his vigor, at the foot of a flowering sal tree, enjoying the bliss of renunciation from the world. So these women in wandering about came upon him and said, "Come here, ladies, and let us sit down and hear somewhat from the priest who is resting at the foot of this tree, until the king awakes." Then they went and saluted him, and sitting in a circle round about him, they said, "Tell us something worth hearing." So the Bodhisattva preached the teaching to them. Meanwhile the royal favorite with a movement of her body woke up the king. And the king, on waking up, and not seeing the women, asked, "Where are those wretches gone?" "Your Highness," she said, "they are gone away and are sitting in attendance on a certain ascetic." The king in a rage seized his sword and went off in haste, saying, "I will give this false ascetic a lesson." Then those of the women that were most in favor, when they saw the king coming in a rage, went and took the sword from the king's hand and pacified him. Then he came and stood by the Bodhisattva and asked, "What teaching are you preaching, monk?" "The teaching of patience, your majesty," he replied. "What is this patience?" said the king. "The not being angry, when men abuse you and strike you and abuse you." Said the king, "I will see now the reality of your patience," and he summoned his executioner. And he in the way of his office took an axe and a lash of thorns, and clad in a yellow robe and wearing a red garland, came and saluted the king and said, "What is your will, sire? Take and drag off this nasty rogue of an ascetic." Said the king, and throwing him on the ground, "With your lash of thorns flog him in front and behind and on both sides, and give him 2,000 stripes." This was done. And the Bodhisattva's outer and inner skins were cut through to the flesh, and the blood flowed. The king again asked, "What teaching do you preach, monk?" "The teaching of patience, your Highness," he replied. "You fancy that my patience is only skin deep. It is not skin deep, but is fixed deep within my heart, where it cannot be seen by you, sire." Again the executioner asked, "What is your will, sire?" The king said, "Cut off both the hands of this false ascetic." So he took his axe, and placing the victim within the fatal circle, he cut off both his hands. Then the king said, "Off with his feet," and his feet were chopped off. And the blood flowed from the extremities of his hands and feet like lac juice from a leaking jar. Again the king asked what teaching he preached. "The teaching of patience, your Highness," he replied. "You imagine, sire, that my patience dwells in the extremities of my hands and feet. It is not there, but it is deep-seated somewhere else." The king said, "Cut off his nose and ears." The executioner did so. His whole body was now covered with blood. Again the king asked of his teaching. And the ascetic said, "Think not that my patience is seated in the tips of my nose and ears. My patience is deep-seated within my heart." The king said, "Lie down, false monk, and from there exalt your patience." And so saying, he struck the Bodhisattva above the heart with his foot, and took himself off. When he was gone, the commander-in-chief wiped off the blood from the body of the Bodhisattva, putting bandages on the extremities of his hands, feet, ears and nose, and then having gently placed him on a seat, he saluted him, and sitting on one side he said, "If, reverend sir, you would be angry with one who has sinned against you, be angry with the king, but with no one else." And making this request, he repeated the first stanza. "Whosoever cut off your nose and ear, and chopped off foot and hand, with him be angry, heroic soul, but spare, we request, this land. The Bodhisattva on hearing this uttered the second stanza. Long live the king, whose cruel hand my body thus has marred. Pure souls like mine such deeds as these with anger never regard. And just as the king was leaving the garden, and at the very moment when he passed out of the range of the Bodhisattva's vision, the mighty earth that is 240,000 leagues in thickness split in two, like unto a strong stout cloth garment, and a flame issuing on from Avicii seized upon the king, wrapping him up as it were with a royal robe of scarlet wool. Thus did the king sink into the earth just by the garden gate, and was firmly fixed in the great hell of Avicii. And the Bodhisattva died on that same day. And the king's servants and the citizens came with perfumes and wreaths and incense in their hands, and performed the Bodhisattva's funeral rites. And some said that the Bodhisattva had gone straight back to the Himalayas. But in this they said the thing that was not. A saint of old, as men have told, great courage did display. That saint so strong to suffer wrong the Kassi king did kill. Alas! The debt of vain regret that king will have to pay. When doomed to dwell in lowest hell, long will he regret the day. These two stanzas were inspired by perfect wisdom. The master, his lesson ended, revealed the truths and identified the birth. At the conclusion of the truths, the bad-tempered brother attained fruition of the second path, while many others attained fruition of the first path. At that time Devadatta was Kalabu king of Kassi, Sariputra was the commander-in-chief, and I myself was the ascetic, the preacher of patience.